Hey everybody, welcome to a presentation on using a specific type of deep learning algorithm to do conversion between 2D and 3D remote sensing data. I'm Graham Gansel. I run the data science department at a software consultancy called Expiro. And I want to take you through a presentation of one of the methods we apply for one of our clients in conjunction with some other assistance, which we'll talk about momentarily. But before we do, I wanted to say thanks to the ODSC organizers for holding this conference virtually. It's strange times out there, and appreciate all of the hard work that they're doing to make sure that this event still happened. With respect to the other parties involved in this work, I wanted to thank our partners in this project. So again, I work for this company, Expiro. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to present this. Thanks to our partner, Metrics, for helping us complete the project. And thanks to the US Department of Energy and SBIR programs for funding the work. Expiro is a data products consulting company. And as such, we build software products that sit at the intersection of data science and machine learning and complex high-performance computing. And the application we'll talk about today sits adjacent to the oil and gas industry. We have offices all over the place, and we have many years of delivering value to customers. With that out of the way, I did want to give a pretty extensive description of what this project is focused on and sort of how it fits into the computing world. This is a remote sensing experiment that has a lot of nomenclature and stuff, and so I'll try to avoid as much nomenclature as I can to get at the point. But it's really important to understand from a use case perspective why the procedures we use are applicable, or else the methodologies won't make sense. So let me give you a pretty deep dive into what we're actually trying to achieve here. So we have a variety of ways of measuring information about the subsurface portion of our Earth. And one of the ways that we do those measurements is by using electromagnetic data to do that. So our aim in this work was to be able to build up an understanding of what's going on underneath the surface of the Earth. Here's my little cartoon depiction of the Earth blown up here with my avatar standing on top. And in the subsurface Earth, you may or may not know that there are many, many layers of rock, different varying rock types, varying lithologies, which we are trying to image for a couple of different reasons. I'll get into the reason for this particular experiment momentarily. Before we jump into that use case, I wanted to take a snapshot of one of these layers. So if we imagine that this layer, the red arrow is pointing to, is a 2D surface, we would map it out as corresponds to this surface on the left-hand side of the slide you see there. Obviously, this is a volumetric world, and the subsurface Earth is three-dimensional. And the data that we're acquiring, as I'll mention in a few slides, adds another dimension to the mix, which is time. And in our case, we're actually looking at this data in the frequency domain. And so we have a sort of transformed time dimension that I'm not showing in this diagram, but will later on. Okay, so why do we care about the layers under the Earth at all? Well, the reason that we care in this experiment is that we are trying to image the reservoir of CO2 that we're interested in the subsurface. This project was working in concert with a couple of other companies to be able to understand the extents, like the lateral and vertical extents of carbon dioxide reservoirs during CO2 sequestration. So during many different types of operations, we produce a lot of CO2. As we know, that's all harmful for the atmosphere. And so we want to be able to sequester that CO2 somehow in the subsurface Earth. And when we do it, we want to know if how much volume we're taking up with CO2. We want to know how big that reservoir is. And in particular, as you see here, we also want to know if those reservoirs are leaking or not. And so what I've shown here in this cartoon view is a plume. So that is a potential leak from that CO2 reservoir, which needs to be addressed. How do we do it? Well, we take electromagnetic data measurements, as mentioned before, from the surface of the Earth. Those are the receivers, those green triangles on the surface, as measured against the transmitter, which is down here in the subsurface Earth, down what is a very small drill borehole, small with respect to the size of the CO2 reservoir. Of course, all of these cartoons I've shown are far, far out of scale. The acquisition strategy here is to be able to look at various frequencies of transmission of electromagnetic data from this transmitter at this gradiometer, at this array of electromagnetic receivers. And so you can imagine what you would be looking at here is a very is a highly multidimensional data set, of course, because you have all sorts of weird transmission and propagation artifacts that are occurring because of the transmitter, the receiver properties, and of course wave propagation effects through this subsurface Earth. What we're looking at in particular with one data type here is the electric field, and we want to measure that electric field in a few different ways. One is you need to measure the real and imaginary components, and you need to measure the X and Y directions and the Z direction. So what we are going to focus on in this actual project is a limited subset of all of these data types, but I'll get into that momentarily. Suffice it to say, from now, you can imagine how many components there are that contribute to the signal received at each one of these electromagnetic receivers. And what would we do with this information? Well, when we receive it, we see this blue panel on the left-hand side. This is what the data actually looks like, and it's not very useful in terms of being able to pinpoint a CO2 reservoir. So in some way, we wish to transform the electromagnetic data we're receiving at the surface into something that looks like a volumetric model that gives us an idea about the extents, the lateral and vertical extents of this geologic object, again, a reservoir in this case. So that is pretty tricky, and this has been studied since the 20s, in fact, and the folks have been doing this with many different data types. Another one could be seismic data, which is acoustic wave propagation, for many decades, and have refined their techniques over those decades. And what folks are doing now to be able to build up a sort of 3D model, geologic model, starting with the EM data, is to perform a physical inversion of that data, of that electromagnetic data. So what we have here is a snapshot of the Maxwell's equations, which are the beginning, that's the starting point for your actual inversion technique. So what you would do, the aim again is to invert this electromagnetic data into a physical model. And in this case, the physical model we're interested in is measured in resistivity. And so you can imagine, actually, let me go back a slide. You can imagine the differential resistivity between a CO2 reservoir, which is empty, and some brine-filled sandstone layer is quite large. So traditionally, we've used Maxwell's equations in a deterministic methodology to invert that electromagnetic data, but that's quite slow. Well, in fact, it's a numeric solution, as you can imagine, numerical solution converging on a stable solution. And that's quite slow. And it's actually so slow that it's almost prohibitive to the workflow. This can take, in some cases, in commercial settings, this can take a month, 2 months to do this inversion. So we want to speed that process up and allow companies that need to monitor these CO2 reservoirs to be able to output that information all the time. Quick, many different turnarounds, so they can understand how the progression of CO2 potential migration is occurring in subsurface Earth. So what we have proposed and then eventually worked through is to use some sort of nonlinear model to represent this physical situation, and to be able to speed up that process to the point at which it's actually realistic to perform that inversion many times. And close readers here may recognize the bottom hand-wavy math as a neural network. And indeed it is. This is just a nested nonlinear equation, which we know is a deep neural network. So we will attempt to use in this experiment some type of deep neural network architecture to approximate the physics that's going on in subsurface Earth in order to get a valuable and realistically quick physical inversion of electromagnetic data into an Earth model measured in resistivity. How do we do it? Well, in reality, what we did was we tried a whole bunch of different things, and a bunch of them failed, and I'll talk through those. And eventually we found one that succeeded. And we did this sort of through multi-dimensional exploration in model types and in various feature engineering exercises, and we'll cover all of those. Before we do, I wanted to give an overview of what the past work in the space consists of. So many of you have probably already seen this. This is, of course, the excellent work by Philip I, who built this system called Pix2Pix, and then subsequently many other systems that are based on the same types of technology. This system in particular, Pix2Pix, is conditional DC-GAN. So DC-GAN is a deep convolutional generative adversarial network. That's a whole lot of words now that I'm saying it out loud. But all that means, if you've never heard of this technology before, is we are using two different deep convolutional networks back to back, training against each other, sort of fighting against each other in a struggle to become more and more accurate. That's the GAN part, generative adversarial network. What we do is we use the first network to generate synthetic images, and the second network to judge whether an image is synthetic or is real. And as you train them against each other, that discriminative network, the one that understands whether images are real or synthetic, gets better and better at determining, is this the real image or is this a synthetic image? Which in turn forces the generator to generate more and more realistic looking images. The output from these DC-GANs can be a variety of different things, and I encourage you to go check out Philip's work on this. It really is great work. We see a few of those settings here where we have potentially like image segmentation to photograph domain transfer, where same thing here, where we have black and white input to colorized output domain transfer. So you can imagine here that the input manifold is black and white space and the output manifold is higher order information space, where there is this sort of, in all of these cases, there is this underdetermined nature to the system. You're starting with less information than you wind up with. And now you can kind of see why we chose these types of approaches as our methodology. We're starting with this set of 2D planes of EM data. Again, I'll describe them all momentarily. And we want to wind up with a 3D volume of information representing subsurface Earth. We worked on this before, and when we did, we used seismic data. So again, this is acoustic data propagated from ground, surface Earth level into subsurface. And we measure the reflections of those acoustic waves at the surface. And what we're interested in, again, exactly identically to our work in this project, is an Earth model, which is the, again, 3D representation of what geology looks like in subsurface Earth. Check out our paper on archive. I helped out with this project, and it is described in great detail there if you're interested in this stuff. In that work, we used a generative adversarial network to come up with these Earth models. You can go look at that work later on. So the question is, can we do the same thing with electromagnetic data that we did with seismic data? So can we take a GAN and generate a 3D model from that 2D input data? Nope. Turns out that does not work so well. And there are a couple of reasons for that. And there are many other small tweaks and tidbits, but we don't have to go into all those because they're not all that interesting. But the main ones are that there is a structural nonconformance between the domains that you're transferring between in the EM case. Again, we saw that EM data before, and it didn't look anything like a 3D model, right? The actual structure in that image doesn't look like the structure in the 3D image in the output. That's critically important. And there is a sort of large insensitivity problem with relationship to stability in GANs. So GANs are notoriously difficult to stabilize. And I'll talk about in a few slides why feature insensitivity is important in this case. Suffice it to say, we had to try something else out. And we did. We tried a bunch of different things. It was a mess. So we tried a huge variety of different model architectures. We tried a huge variety of different pre-processing steps and every combination thereof. So we started with the GAN type of analysis. We used full 3D inversion technique, domain transfer techniques. We used a multi-channelized input with respect to a 3D and even a 2D output, which actually was somewhat successful, but wouldn't have been in a commercial setting. And we tried variational autoencoders, and eventually what we arrived on was a actually quite simple, fully convolutional network architecture, which helped not only stabilize the solution, but also helped us be able to very minutely control the input to output domain effects. And again, I'll go into those details momentarily. But we did try a few different flavors of fully convolutional networks. The one that we eventually landed on, and I'll show you the model architecture in a couple slides, is just a plain encoder-decoder framework with the deep dimensionality exchange protocol in the middle. This is another photo of the data type that we're working with in this experiment. And there's another slide after this one to go into a little bit more detail. So just bear with me here for a moment. We have on the left-hand side of the image a single channel of our EM data. In this case, it is the electric field X direction real component of that EM data. The output is a slice, like a horizontal slice. This is a plan view of the Earth model, of that 3D Earth model. And so you can, obviously this is synthetic data. We can't show the proprietary customer data, but the real data. But we actually did train this system on a huge amount of synthetic data examples with very little real data injected. And I'll go over those details later on. So we just see this sort of yellow color. Apologies for not putting the color bars on here, but they're not really all that important. Background resistivity level in yellow, and then a reservoir here with a drastically different resistivity. And you can see the small plume that is ejecting from the top of the CO2 reservoir there. This EM data does not look great, right? It's actually very difficult to tell which data sample you're looking at just by looking at this sort of wildly blank input data panel. And that is important, and I'll dive into those details here in about 4 slides. Suffice it to say that it takes a lot of transfer. You can imagine taking a log scale of this panel and getting a little bit more visibility into what's going on here. And those types of transformations, like the log, ended up being really important to this work. This is another more detailed picture of what the data looks like. Again, synthetic data here. We have 4 panels in this case as input to the system. And I've just taken 2 slices of the Earth model here, as that's the output, right? This is important. So there's 4 panels here, and in this work, that's all we injected into the model. So these 4 panels are the electric field x direction real component, an imaginary component, and then the electric field y direction real component, an imaginary component. So the reason, so as you can see here, we have not injected the magnetic field into this system for inversion. There are a variety of reasons for that. Again, not all that interesting, but suffice it to say that our acquisition strategy for real data precluded that. What you can see though is that the 4 channels have some similarities, and they have some symmetry between them, of course. But again, these input data do not represent the output 3D data structure, geometry, in any sort of easy to understand way, even as a human being. I would posit that we could look at this EM data or variations of this and not really understand without quite a lot of work how that EM data relates to the subsurface structure. In the Earth model over here, you can see a background resistivity level here in purple, and then this, by the way, this synthetic example is not physically realistic. I just chose this one because it's very high contrast. It looks good on a slide, so the units in this case are not actually correct. But for the magnitudes, the color bars, the measurements we're taking here, or the models that we're using here, we built up using just a deterministic algorithm. And effectively, to build our training data set, we generated an absolute ton of synthetic Earth models with various permutations, including background resistivity levels, layering of the subsurface rock layers, reservoir geometries, layer geometries, and then indeed plume geometry perturbations. So having built up a gigantic training set of synthetic data, synthetic Earth models using a deterministic system, we then used physical modeling to generate EM data through these Earth models. And that built up a big portion of the training data set, 98, 99%. And then what happens effectively, like transfer learning, is that when you get ready to move into the commercial domain, then we inject the real data on top of that training data set to retrain the weights of the network. This is the network. This is what it looks like. So again, I mentioned it's super, super simple. Really, any type of architecture in the encoder decoder style would work for this type of experiment. We have multi-channel 2D input, which we looked at on the last slide. Those channels obviously being the components of electric field. And we just go through a standard encoding process. Again, remember this is fully convolutional. So there's no destruction of information by flattening or anything like that. And eventually we arrive at these encoded latent layers. And well, skip that for now. On the opposite side, on the decoder side, we perform the inverse operation, of course. So if it's on the encoder side, it's convolution pooling. Then on the decoder side, it's unpooling and convolution transpose, which is an approximation for inverse for deconvolution. But in the middle here, this is the tricky bit. It is dead simple in terms of its implementation, but it is a little bit tricky to get it tuned right. So all we do, as you can see here in my colored cartoon, are taking the 2D latent feature maps and reshaping them element by element into 3D feature maps. And the reason that I say it's tricky is because we have to make sure that the elements coming in from the encoder correspond to the correct elements and the same number of elements in the decoder architecture here. So this work can be done for any remote sensing experiment, of course. If you're trying to perform an inversion or some type of data transfer modeling scenario, You can do it with this type of architecture. When you do this deep dimensionality exchange, however, there is a problem related to the input and output data dimensionality. In our case, it's 2D to 3D. It could be anything you wish. But the reason that I mention this is because in the 2D to 3D case, this number of elements, like red to red, blue to blue, has to be equal across the dimensionality exchange protocol. And what that means for 2D to 3D is that you have to have perfect squares of elements on the encoder side and perfect cubes of elements on the decoder side, which is, theoretically, it's quite simple, of course. But what happens is that when you're actually implementing this stuff in reality, it's pretty tricky to tune the number of elements here with respect to the input and output data shapes. So for instance, you could blow up the input data to any size you wish, which would destroy your computational efficiency to get a number of elements in the encoder and decoder, the perfect squares to perfect cubes. And if you were to do that, that would be wonderful if you had all the compute resources in the world. But assuming you don't, you have to trade off the amount of information contained in these respective feature maps, because as you convolve, you lose elements in the feature map. You effectively lose elements in the feature map. So a little bit of a tricky tuning procedure here. I will also suggest that if you aren't so restrictive about perfect squares to cubes or whatever your dimensionalities are, you can either pad or maybe interpolate or something so that one or more of your dimensions don't correspond exactly. So it's a little bit destructive to the information in the system, but it does work. Here's the other problem that we mentioned. This is the feature, the stability issue that we ran into with respect to our different input data samples. On the right-hand column here, you can see the data samples across different records in the data set look very, very similar. But the left-hand column is the output. That's the Earth model, right? And those Earth models are quite different, except for the bottom two, chosen on purpose, of course. The middle two output columns are outputs from two different network architectures, and you can see that we have a ghosting problem. So the issue here is that the subtle changes, the changes in the input features, are so subtle that it's difficult for the network to delineate between those input samples at transform time. And you could definitely fix this by just adding more depth to your network, of course, because you'd have more mixing in your latent layers. But again, we don't have all the money or compute in the world. So we did a transform to the input data to be able to tease out the subtle differences between samples in the input data fields. I mentioned log at the beginning of this talk, and you can imagine here doing a log would be quite beneficial, but it turns out it's not beneficial enough. So what we did was we chose by some convergence criterion the optimal set of feature transforms to be able to tease out the differences in the input data. I'm something of an operations research nerd, and so when I saw this problem that the team was having, I quickly concocted this scheme to be able to solve it. And it's cool, it worked out pretty well. So we took a huge library of different transform functions, and we effectively built a quality of fit metric that we used to measure how different the input samples were. And we applied, using Bayesian search, the different, not only feature transforms, but the combinations thereof, and in order to maximize the difference in input samples. And this is a small subset of the stuff we tried. It got too busy when I added more things to it. And as you can see, one stands out in particular. That's not by accident. I chose it just for this display, of course. But it was, and I believe there were some other deterministic transforms that happened at this time, but the main thrust of this thing is that we use the eigenvector decomposition of the integral transform of the input data, which gave us the best difference in input features. And that worked. So what's left? Well, it turns out that this takes a lot of computational resources. So there's a lot to do, and it is related to the deployment, the operationalization of this system. So again, we've trained our network, and now we have an inference engine, which is super speedy to deploy and to run in the field. But the training of this system takes a long time and costs a lot of money. And so when we have to retrain it, like for instance, if we're working on a different geological setting or like somewhere else in the world, whatever, we might need to do some fine-tuning training. Well, there are a variety of things we can do to assist with those tasks in terms of compute resources, model quantization. There's also changing the model architecture a bit. And in our case for this experiment, we did just use something related to plain MSE, mean squared error. But there's you can be a lot clever about your loss function and converge much more quickly. So those efforts are ongoing, and I'd love to hear from the audience if you have ideas about where to head with that. And then, of course, the next thing to do is to integrate this data product into a dashboard that the users in the field can use to understand where their CO2 reservoirs are. And we just have a couple example dashboards with embedded data products here. So variety of different industries. I mentioned we work in a bunch of different spaces, but you can see the commonality here is that like the output from this inversion system is what would feed one little tiny chunk of an overall dashboard for monitoring the CO2 sequestration. And of course, I wouldn't be here without Expero's help, and we build all of these things, all these components from front end to back end and algorithms. If you have any questions, please follow up with me there, and I will be happy to entertain any questions. Thanks.